Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day in January 1976, it is the Iowa caucuses, the very first and the very cold first step in the nomination process for president. And in Iowa, in 1976, a man by the name of Jimmy Carter has just played the game perfectly. At this point, sitting here where we are now, we kind of all understand that Iowa is a very interesting place and a very important place, and that the caucus system has its own strange rules and customs, and that often the candidate who knows how to work the system there is the one who can gain momentum and really launch themselves into the conversation in an election year. But in 1976, this was all relatively new, and Jimmy Carter really was the first one to figure out how to play this particular game. In part because he'd had a bit of a hand, let's say, in setting up the rules of that game, something we'll kind of get into, but it's an interesting wrinkle. But let's talk about Carter at the 76 caucuses, and of course, particularly interesting now because the Democratic Party has said that it is done with Iowa in the dead of winter, that they'd rather be running around on the beaches of South Carolina, which I think just from the glorious meteorological,
South Carolina.
From a meteorological standpoint, I think makes total sense. We can get into whether, what it means for electoral politics. But yes, I have had to drive around Iowa in the dead of winter, and it's a thing. But anyway, here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And you know what? As I introduce, I should also plug, I have a new show coming out. It's called Good Sport. So we're going to do a Good Sport week coming down the line. But
Awesome.
I need to be better about starting to mention that I have a new 8-part show called Good Sport, which I'm very excited about, and I hope people will listen to it and you'll hear more about it. But let's move on to Iowa in 76. I guess we should start with just the idea that, we do take it for granted that it's a thing, right? Iowa, New Hampshire, 72 was the first year that really Iowa caucuses happened in the way that we understand now, and no one really knew what was going on. 76 is when Carter really hacks it. But give us a sense of, NIki, if you can, of kind of how new this game really was at that point.
So it was pretty new. There had been primary and caucuses in the past, but the way that a party nominee was decided was not entirely related to those primaries and caucuses, so much so that in 1968, when Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee, he did so without winning primaries. Listeners who are familiar with this era will recall that Lyndon Johnson didn't drop out of the race until the end of March 1968. So Humphrey hadn't thrown his hat in the ring until pretty late in the game. And there was this sense, especially after the violent clashes of the 1968 convention, that Democrats said, this is not particularly democratic. What if we change the rules so that the people get a voice in who becomes the party nominee? And that's when you get, in 72, the McGovern-Fraser Commission, and that's when you get primaries and caucuses being the determining factor in deciding who the Democratic nominee will be.
This is interesting. I've said this many times on the podcast that I love Jimmy Carter. And part of the reason I appreciate him is because I think that he's always like this underdog or undervalued, or people sort of see him as like this, nice guy next door. He's always sort of counted out, I guess, or people sort of maybe forget about him. They don't see him as a shark. They don't see him as someone who's calculated and willing to shank you or something like that. But this, for me at least, seems the first moment in which I'm getting to see Jimmy Carter as like the ultimate campaigner, the ultimate politician, like someone who's like, okay, you want to play? Let's play. It just.
So what are the specific things that he did that gave you a sense of Jimmy the Shark? I like this.
Well, oh my gosh. I mean, first of all, the campaign trail, I know that campaigns are exhausting. You have to go a lot of different places that you just don't want to go. But when I read that he went to over 40 states and 250 cities in 260 days, all before votes are taken, I'm tired.
Well, and it's true that people even
crazy.
Talk about kind of Iowa being a test of just that, like that pure stamina, right? Because nothing is it's just small towns 2 hours apart, right? And you just have to hustle. You have to hit the road. And so like at some basic level, it's like a good test of like, can you just hack it at that level of just like day after day, getting on a plane, getting on a car.
The stamina, the endurance, the shaking hands, kissing babies, being likable the whole time. That's exhausting to me. And to be able to have that kind of momentum or endurance to keep going is just, it's wild.
Yeah.
This is something that Iowa stands out as a particular golden period for the Obama campaign. People talk about, their time in Iowa with these glowing faces and big smiles. But it was a grinding
You do that when you end up
on the
winning.
ground there. You do. It looks a lot better in hindsight.
Buttigieg's campaign is probably not. Well, I guess they had a good Iowa, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
But it's not just like going out and shaking hands and getting people to go vote. You have to get people to go caucus.
Yes.
Yeah. And caucusing is just like the rules are arcane. People have to be like brought up in it in order to understand it. And so it's a lot of like door knocking and then explaining and then cajoling in order to get people to come together. And Jimmy Carter is really the first Democrat to crack that particular code.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just cajoling to get them to come, right? But I mean, famously, the caucuses, it's cajoling in real time that night. Yeah. And so it is like relationships, and it ends up being basically people in real time. Can you convince someone that hopefully you have a relationship with to then convince their neighbors to do something, and Carter is very tactical about this and recognizes this. So he hires an organizer, a man by the name of Tim Kraft, who then they set up 20 statewide committees. Each of those is going to really focus on like one small part of the state and get to know every single voter. All stuff that is kind of like on the first page of the playbook now, but was really new back then.
And Carter is such an interesting outcome in 1976 in Iowa because he really was an outsider. We forget how impressive it is that Carter won this nomination because he was the governor of Georgia. He was not a particularly well-known figure. He had ties with the party structure, with the Democratic National Committee, but he wasn't like a name that people knew. And so he had to do a combination of both getting his name out there, being seen as a viable candidate, and then persuading all of these Iowa voters that, hey, take a chance on Jimmy, which is ultimately what he persuades them to do.
Yeah. What's crazy to me is that when he decided to run, his hometown newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, headlined his campaign with Jimmy who?
Right.
And it's like, ouch. He was the governor, that usually means something. But when you have 11 other Democrats, running for office, we've seen these, massive races before where it's a dozen or so people and, you have to dwindle down into the final 3 or 2 or whoever. But it can be really grueling, and it can be really difficult to stand out in a big race like that where everyone is trying to, vie for attention.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, like Carter's particular strengths and persona fit really well into both Iowa as a state. I mean, he's a farmer, but also just the sort of specifics of how you gain traction there. In particular, coming into the mid 70s, there were campaign finance reforms. It was like the sort of balance was swinging much more back towards small donors. It just fit into this larger ethos of like, we're going to just talk to people. We're going to reach them one by one. We're going to sort of do all that kind of on the ground stuff that, again, really bears out in a state like Iowa in a caucus system.
And it's a year in which not being the establishment favorite is actually something really good, right? There had been this kind of anti-establishment movement churning in the Democratic Party. And then you have the Watergate hearings and the sense that Washington is just so corrupt. And one of the things that Jimmy Carter was able to do was be like, I don't have any ties to Washington. Like, I'm just this guy out here running Georgia. And that was a real selling point in a way that it hadn't been in earlier years. His lack of connections, his lack of sort of establishment credentials, which is what you needed in order to get the party nomination in the past, was actually a real boon for him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Kellie, you want to know the part of this that makes me most realize how savvy Carter was? It was the night of the Iowa caucuses. So now we kind of, there's satellite TV. All the networks go to Iowa and they set up studios there and, they spend a week there. That sort of whole ecosystem wasn't really around in 76. So what does Carter do? He's like, well, I'm not going to just win Iowa and then have it be this thing that happened in the middle of the country. Now I'm stuck in the middle of the country. The night of the caucuses, he flies to New York. Yeah. So that when it's announced that he had won, the next morning he's there in New York and he does hits on every single network morning show as the guy who just won these Iowa caucuses, and now it's off to New Hampshire, and he just really captured that moment. But that is,
genius.
That is super savvy for sure.
I mean, that's genius to be able to fly back and do NBC, ABC, CBS, all of that. And I'm sure they were like, what are you doing here? He probably, he took a red eye. Again, this is all really, choreographed. But yeah, whoever is running his campaign strategy, that's savvy move right there. Real savvy. Yeah. And it promotes him to do other big things. The first time he was ever to be on CBS's Face the Nation as a real contender is in this moment.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a real reminder that media savvy and media strategy is actually a key component of winning political campaigns. You can win without it, and you can lose while having it, but it really is something that the very best politicians are always paying attention to.
Well, and it's funny because I think that the primary and caucus system teaches you there's two different games being played. One is the media game, as you're saying, and the other is the specific rules of that party and the power structure, not just within each state, but within each party, and which levers can you pull. And we see that so often that it's the people who understand those particulars who are the ones, and to me, I'm just kind of well, neither of those are actually the voters, right? One is the press, and one is this party apparatus, which of course is what nominates but that's where I think there's just this sense of disconnect, and that it's sometimes well, if you're the people who know how to play this particular game that has been set up within this particular smaller ecosystem, are those the ones that prevail? Is that the best outcome? And I hinted at it in the intro. There's a little bit of that in here because, as we said, Carter, prior to this, he'd been a governor, but in the intervening years, he had become the chairman of the campaign committee at the DNC in the very years that they were starting to kind of decide that the Iowa caucuses were going to be a key part of this all. So I, don't think that there's evidence that he rigged the rules to make them Carter friendly, but he clearly sort of saw the game that was emerging before others because he probably had a front row seat to setting it up, and so that positioned him to do all the things we just discussed for sure.
No better way to get to know the rules than writing the rules.
I know, right?
So what about rewriting the rules? So now here we are in 2023. We're about to be in 2024. There's probably someone who's already moved to Iowa, right? There's always one candidate who moves to Iowa way too early. But they're not moving to Iowa anymore. They're going to South Carolina. I don't know if you have thoughts on that change, or whether you just think kind of no matter what state you pick, it's going to be this its particular weird rules are going to emerge and have over influence. But I don't know. Do you feel bad for Iowa?
Iowa has had its moment in the sun. Look.
Not in the sun. Absolutely not in the sun.
Not in the sun, no. In the snow. It has had its moment in the snow and the spotlight. And at least for the Democratic Party, demographically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the broader national electorate for the Democratic Party. It doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of voting. The idea that caucusing, which selects for particular types of voters, is the way that you select these first candidates. And momentum is something that's very real in the primary system. And so it's not always determinative, but you are sort of potentially setting your party up to fail by having a selection process that doesn't favor your party and the people who vote for it.
Yeah. I do think, this has been the running argument for a long time, is that Iowa, and even to that extent, New Hampshire is not very representative of the country as a whole. And sort of starting out in maybe a state that is more diverse or larger or southern or what have you, does give a little bit clearer of a picture of who might be a viable candidate. It's not, I mean, none of it is sort of like fail proof, but I do think that it will be interesting going forward to see like who sort of shakes out fast and early in these campaign season.
Yeah, and I mean, it is funny. I mean, I do think the order really matters, and I do think that it sends a message about kind of what kind of party you want to be. I also just, at the same time, think that elections are becoming so nationalized that maybe, this switch is happening at the very moment that things are, I mean, like, and I know the GOP is different from the Democrats in lots of ways, at this moment, but like Donald Trump didn't care whether he was in Iowa, New Hampshire, whatever state he was in, he was going to say the same thing, and it was going to be on national TV. And so, like, I think there's something there about the sort of modern nature of elections for sure.
We will hear a lot less talk about ethanol. That's for sure.
That's true. I suppose we will hear a lot less talk about ethanol.
I do think that we, the idea of maybe like rotating the states might also be a good way to approach it, because states, I don't know, they get a little too comfortable with their position in the lineup.
Well,
so
there's also this really interesting argument that yes, Iowa, like, it's to be in the political spotlight in that way every 4 years is incredible. But for people who are politically engaged in Iowa, it's like all consuming to deal with this national thing. And there's an argument that like it takes the attention away from the most politically committed people in a relatively small state when they have to deal with this national circus, when they could have probably just be like focused on local issues. And it is this interesting angle, and so we'll see if Iowa just kind of like can get back to Iowa's business going forward.
Imagine what a nirvana Iowa is going to be in like 10 years once it's no longer first in the nation.
Exactly. All right. Well, this is super interesting, and we always love doing Jimmy Carter stuff. I feel like we're inching. The arc of our Carter conversations are becoming less hapless as we go. I feel like each one is slightly positioning himself a little better. So I like that.
This is true, yeah.
I like that course.
Love me some Jimmy.
Yeah. All right. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
In the beginning, Jimmy Carter's campaign was a lonely one. But through the months, more and more people recognized him as a new leader. A man who will change the way this country is run. Jimmy Carter, a leader for a change.
Radiotopia. From